Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta and thank you for joining me today. Today is Saturday. I'm recording this in the morning as I prepare for a horseshoe tournament at a friend of mine's. Big horseshoe tournament that we have here. It's in Massachusetts. We got, 12 to 15 teams of two that are going to just go out there and have at it. And hopefully when all's said and done, I'll be hoisting the victory trophy. And there'll be a full keg there, a pool. It's going to be a grand old time. But before I did that, I wanted to talk a little bit today about Adam's curse. All right, and I'll probably share this one tomorrow. One of the big arguments for people is that, Adam's curse. What about Adam's curse? Everybody's still under Adam's curse, right? But they're not realizing that Adam's curse went away when Israel's law went away. All right, that is the most important thing that you could ever say to anybody, or you could ever show to anybody, to get away from that nonsensical type thinking that they are under the curse of Adam, which, by the way, had everything to do with the condemnation of the law. All right, so when they say, well, we're still under the curse of Adam, right? You tell them they're not under the curse and they get mad, right? They want to be under the curse. This is the delusion that religion carries with it. So Adam's curse went away when Israel's age ended. That's the whole point of the New Testament. All right, Christ had come. He was the last Adam. He was doing away with the curse. And I'm going to show you here in a moment how that curse goes away. There's no more curse once everything is made new. And everything being made new related to the destruction of Israel's covenant, the destruction of Israel's age, the destruction of the temple, and the coming of the Lord to take his saints to the age to come, where there would be no more death, no more tears, no more pain, right? So, when people, first of all, people like to say, oh, there's, Adam's death or Adam's transgression affected all of us. Well, that's just false, all right? And what I like to do is I like to always ask people, this is another question that you can stump people with. If you take them to Romans chapter 5 and you say, take a look at verse 13, right? Where it says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law, right? And this is obviously Paul sort of mirroring and referring back to Adam, obviously, because he's talking about through the one man. So we know that what he's talking about is the period when Adam was in the garden walking naked and unashamed, and his eyes were open. All right, and the eyes being open and naked and unashamed, right, means that he had no guilt, right? He had no imputed sin. He wasn't guilty. He was alive. Basically a picture of him before the law came. All right, but look at what Paul says. He says, for until the law, sin was in the world, but sin was not imputed where there is no law. So that's Adam in the garden before the law came, before he was put under the law. Now, what you can ask these wannabes, and it throws them for a loop every time, right? Usually don't even get an answer. They just kind of vanish, right? They're raptured when you ask them this question. But the question that you need to ask them is, what period in time is Paul speaking of where the law was not around, sin was around, but the law wasn't around, but sin was not imputed? Right? Now that just blows people's minds, because they're like, wait a minute, you mean to tell me that there's a period in human history that Paul speaks of where people were sinning and it wasn't imputed? How does that work, right? Their minds explode. They have their brains pop, because they've been trained to just think that sin is the problem in the story, when really what the story shows is it's a combination of the law giving power to sin, right? Without the law, sin was powerless. It had no ability to kill. It wasn't imputed. There was no guilt. But when the law came, what it did is it gave strength, right? The law gave sin its strength. And so it brought the death with it. Right? That's what it did. It imputed, it killed. Right? Sin took opportunity by the commandment and brought the death. That's what it did. But before that commandment came, before the law came, sin was there. Sin was existing, and there was no problem whatsoever with God. Imagine that. A period in time that Paul refers to where there is sin in the world, but not imputed. That's sort of mind-blowing, right? But they'll never have an answer for it. They can't answer it. They can't see how Adam's eyes being closed represents that he was sinning, yes, but it wasn't imputed to him, right? They think Adam was perfect, but that's not what Paul says at all. Adam was not perfect. Adam's eyes were closed. He was unaware. He had no guilt. He had no shame. He had no imputed sin. And the reason why he had none of those things was because the law, the ministry of condemnation and wrath and death, that hadn't been given yet. All right, so take them back to that place. Walk them back. Grab them by the hand and say, come on, little wannabe, follow me. I want to show you something. Take them over to Romans 5 and show them exactly what Paul says about the time and ask them, when was this in history? Because remember, the common Christian delusional belief is that all people from the start, right from the start when Adam began, right, all people are under a law. Well, let's back it up. They say Adam was perfect. Adam had no sin, right? This is a core Christian belief here, that Adam was perfect in the garden. No sin whatsoever before the tree, which was the law, right? The knowledge of good and evil. That's what the law does. It gives knowledge of good and bad. But no sin is the belief, right? Adam was perfect. No sin, no trespassing, nothing before the law, but they've got it all wrong. Adam was not perfect. Adam was not a sinless creature. Adam was sinning. Adam surely did have sin, according to Paul, because until the law, sin was in the world, but sin wasn't imputed where there was no law. And that's exactly Adam, naked, unashamed, eyes closed. When the law came and he broke that law, what happened? His eyes were open. He became aware of his nakedness. He was guilty. He died, meaning his sin was imputed, because we know the law brings about wrath, right? For where there is no law, there is no transgression. So that's the whole point. Right? And whether or not Adam was a real person or he just is a representation of Israel symbolically being under the law, who knows, right? Who really knows? Could be just a story that the Israelites referred back to as sort of a legend of their beginnings and where the law began, and this figure who was their earliest patriarch. I mean, we know Isaiah believed that Adam was the first father of Israel, right? Isaiah said, your first father sinned and your mediators have transgressed against me. The first father is Adam, folks. Okay? And we know Paul takes the history of Israel all the way back to Adam right here in Romans 5. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, that's the first father. That's Israel's first father who sinned. Okay? And so the problem was the law. All right? That's what gave sin its strength. That's what gave it its killing power. That's when Adam's eyes were opened. All right. And so they don't have any answers for that. But what's interesting is that Paul, in Galatians chapter 3, says exactly what the curse was. Now, this, of course, goes all the way back. The Bible is tricky, right? Okay, you have Adam as sort of a microcosm representation of Israel in the law. Adam is the first father. He's the earliest patriarch. He's the one where the law began. Right? The story of law transgression and death and bondage and burden and all this stuff and cursing began at Adam. Right? He's a microcosm of Israel. He's the start of the law. And as you go through the story, it sort of builds up upon that. And you have Noah and first you have Abel and Cain sacrificing on the altar for sins, right? Then you have Noah, and you go through the whole story. But everywhere in this story, you see it's a covenant framework, right? We see Noah, that he was the only one who was righteous, right? And in biblical terms, righteous means obeying the law. That's what righteous means. He was obeying the law. He was the only one out of the whole covenant framework in his day that was righteous to God. He was the only one who obeyed the law and who adhered to the commandments. So God destroys the covenant people. A great flood comes upon all the land. He destroys his people, and he preserves Noah. And then when Noah steps off the ark, he tells Noah that he would now establish his covenant with him. He gives him new commandments. But we see the covenant framework is all the way through, right? And, what's interesting is like I forget where it is. I'm trying to think where I found something in terms of like a high priest. Okay, here it is. It's in Leviticus 4. I was reading this a few weeks ago, and I just noticed a startling connection to Adam here. And now, obviously, I've said many times in the past, who Adam was. He was a high priest for the people, and we can see that Cain and Abel are also making sacrifices for sins for the people and, for the covenant people. And so I was reading through this, and I noticed something in Leviticus 4. It says this about the sin offering. It says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord in anything which ought not to be done, and does any of them," ready? It says, "If the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bull without blemish as a sin offering." So what's interesting about that is it's pretty much identical to what we see take place with Adam, right? Now, notice the exclusivity of what this is talking about here in Leviticus. It's saying, the Lord is speaking to Moses. He's saying, speak to the children of Israel. He says, if the anointed priest sins, bringing guilt on the people, then let him offer to the Lord for his sin. That's exactly what took place with Adam, is it not? Exactly. The anointed priest, Adam, sinned and brought death and guilt to the people. Right? Guilt, death, condemnation, it's all sort of the same thing, imputation, and it all came by way of the law. And so here's Moses being told that the high priest, who's the head of the people, the head of the covenant, if he sins, he'll bring guilt upon all the people. And he'll need an offering for that. That is exactly what happened with Adam, which again shows that through Adam, sin came into the world. Was really nothing more than Adam as a high priest bringing guilt to the covenant people. And it's a microcosm of Israel. It's a starting point. And as you go through the story, you see that you have the law in its earliest forms, earliest stages, very, very bland, very vague law, just offering up, sacrifices and things on an altar for sin. As you get to Noah, you see that expanded upon a little more. Then you get to Abraham, and you see God commanding Abraham with laws, and he's sacrificing. Right? So the law is building, and then as you get to Israel, you have now this huge law, this huge set of laws that made sin exceedingly sinful, right? And it magnified their guilt. So the whole story is about law. It's about transgression of law. And ultimately, the law of Moses had gone all the way back to the garden, right? In its earlier form. Now, it wasn't called the law of Moses. Obviously, that was a name that was given to it later, the Mosaic law and whatnot. But these commandments that are contained in that set of laws go all the way back, right? Go all the way back. They go back to, sacrificing, to unclean. We see God commanding Noah about clean and unclean animals. I mean, this goes back long before. Okay, then obviously the promise was made when the circumcision commandment was given to Abraham. Right? But this is just basically a backstory. You don't really have to think about Adam and them too much, right? Because what's nice about the New Testament is it caps it off. You can see the end of it right there. You can see when Adam's curse went away. Let's go back over to Galatians chapter 3 and look what Paul says about the curse. He says, "For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things which are written in the book of law to do them." Now let's stop there for a minute. Paul is exclusifying, if that's even a word, who's under the curse. He's saying, for the people who are of the works of the law, these are the ones under the curse. The people who are under the law are under the curse. And we know, obviously, from a number of different passages that only Israel had the law. No one else did. Okay, I don't need to get into that and go off on a rabbit trail, but if you followed me and listened, you know that there's a host of passages that prove that. So only Israel had the law. Paul says, for as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. He's speaking of the same law. He's not speaking of another law. Okay? He's not speaking of a dumb moral heart law that people think they're under, which is nonsense because the Bible says nothing of it. In fact, the only ones who ever had the law in their heart were the covenant people. That's the whole point. He says, "For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do all things which are written in the book of law." Not written in the heart, written in the book of law. Who had the book of law? Israel did. Who had the commandments? Israel did. Who had the covenants? Israel did. All right? So the law brings about a curse. Now that obviously ties back to what we see with Moses. I mean, how many times throughout the Torah do we see Moses talking about a curse? Just go read the book of Deuteronomy. And you'll probably see the word curse dozens upon dozens of times. Because Moses was outlining at the start of Israel's history, okay, that they were to observe this law with all their heart, all their mind, all their strength, with everything they had. Every ounce of their being was to be dedicated to the law. He tells them to be careful to observe everything written in this book. Well, there's the book that Paul spoke of in Galatians 3. Cursed are those who don't do all things written in the book, isn't it? And Moses told them that they should write it on their foreheads, their doorposts, speak of it when they wake up, speak of it when they lie down, speak of it to their children. It was to be everything to them. It was to be written on their hearts and engraved in their minds. That's what it meant. Metaphorically speaking, it was to be everything for them. All right, so you have this outlining from Moses to the covenant people that the law was everything to them. What other great nation, Israel, has this law that your God is setting before you today? Nobody did. That was the point. And they were entrusted with this law, and it was to be everything to them. But Moses also told them, right on the side of all these blessings that he promised them, if they were to just abide and worship him and be strict about his covenant and his commandments. Right alongside of that was a warning. And the warning was, if you mess up, you're in trouble, because it can also be a curse. Right? This was a covenant of blessings and curses. So the law brought about the curse if you didn't abide by it, if you weren't careful to continue to do all things which were written in it. And that's, talk about a curse, right? You have to do all things written in this book of law, which in other places it says is nearly impossible, right? If you're guilty in one point, you're guilty of them all, which is, of course, why they needed sacrifices, and on and on and on it went, never perfecting anyone. So, point being is that this curse framework and motif is outlined and started at Adam as a microcosm. He sins, he brings guilt upon the covenant people, he's banished. And we see that sort of theme and motif kind of carried on throughout, right? We see the law always there with the covenant people, those whom God covenanted with. And that goes on and on and on through the patriarchs, all the way till we get to Israel. And then, of course, we see Israel mirroring Adam because they sinned and transgressed the covenant and were banished from the garden, that being Jerusalem. This is all over the prophets. Jerusalem literally was called the Garden of Eden because it was the place where God dwelled. So again, there's a lot of symbolism with Adam that matches with the stuff we see with Israel and their garden, which was Jerusalem, the temple, the place of God's presence. Right? When the prophets are prophesying about the rebuilding of the city and the temple, they say that foreigners would walk by and say, look, that place that was once desolate has now become like the Garden of Eden and the Garden of God. So there's all this imagery describing that. But the point is that it's all wrapped around and centered around God's presence, the law, the covenant. That's what it was all about. All right, and Paul says here that as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. Cursed is everyone who does not continue to do all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Now, if God said he only gave his laws to Israel, the covenant people, then that automatically eliminates everybody from the curse. Because Paul's whole point here is that the people who don't do the things written in the book of the law are under the curse. Clearly, it's covenant focused. Okay, which is why Paul also says that he was born into the law to redeem those under the law, which is why Hebrews says he died for sins committed under the old covenant. It's all about old covenant transgressions under the law. Then he goes on in verse 13 of Galatians 3, he says, Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. Now, people like to say, well, he was just talking to the Jews there. No, he wasn't just talking to the Jewish Galatians. He was talking to the Gentile Galatians as well. He was talking to the full scope of elect Israelite sheep living in Galatia, both Jew and Gentile, both law practicing and non-law practicing. Both parties, law practicing and non-law practicing Israelites, were both under the curse. And both parties were redeemed from the curse of the law, according to Paul in Galatians 3:13. Now, if God didn't declare his laws to anyone but Israel, and he tells these elect sheep in Israel in Galatia, that Christ has redeemed them from the curse of the law, then who do you think these elect sheep are? They have to be Israel. Because it makes no sense for God to say on one hand that he gave his laws to no one but Israel, but yet Paul here in Galatians 3 to be talking to pagans saying he has redeemed us from the curse of that law. That's dumb. They all have to fall under that law. And these were Israelites who were dead in trespasses and sins, who were uncircumcised in the flesh, who had given up the Sabbath, who had probably been eating all sorts of foods that they shouldn't have. And this is probably a byproduct of the Hellenization period where many, many Israelites left and became Greeks. Okay? It's all there, right, in history. Just read the book of the Maccabees, read history, understand what was going on in that cultural time frame. And you can see many Israelites leaving, okay? And so it all sets up perfectly for Paul to come along and say, hey, you've been out here, you've been abandoning the law, you've been uncircumcised, you're not worshiping God, you're not observing the Sabbath, you're eating all sorts of bad things. So Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law, having become a curse for us. All right? Now, so that goes to show you the exclusivity of the law, and that ties back to what Moses said, right? The curse was always related to the law, but here's the kicker, all right? When somebody says to you that they're still under the curse of Adam, well, first of all, if it's a futurist, it's kind of tough because they don't believe their Bibles, they don't believe the story, they don't believe what Jesus said, they have no concept of audience relevance and time statements. It's a mess. Futurism is a totally different animal. That you kind of have to approach a different way. But most people who listen to my stuff, I would assume, are of the full preterist persuasion. They understand that Jesus said he was coming in that generation. They understand he was promising to come before some standing there died. They understand that all the time statements show that there was an imminent coming and an imminent end, and everything was at the door, and the judge was at the door, and the destruction was at the door, and the ruler of this world will soon be cast out, and everything is right there. That's why they were in the last days. So in order to really grasp this sort of truth, you have to first, believe what the Bible says and understand that there's time statements. All right, and you've got to believe those time statements. Otherwise, it's all nonsense anyway, because if you don't believe what Christ said in terms of the time statements, then none of it makes any difference, right? It's just all nonsense. You can just believe whatever you want. You don't have to keep things in proper context if you're a futurist. But Christ said he was coming in that generation. All these things were about to take place. All right? And that includes Revelation 22. Okay? Revelation's tricky. It looks back. It looks way back. It looks at the times that John wrote, roughly 10 years before the end. And it also looks ahead a little bit to the time when they would inherit that age to come, where they would be like angels in heaven, because they were on the cusp, right? They were still, leading up to that point. It hadn't happened yet, obviously, because here's John writing while he's on the earth. He hadn't been taken up in his immortal heavenly body yet, but he's writing about this, which was going to take place. And he says this in Revelation 22. He says, he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as a crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and the Lamb. And in the middle of its street and on either side was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations, and that word is just ethnos, people. And here it is. It says, and there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. They shall see his face, and his name shall be on their foreheads. Right? Now, first of all, we know who this body of individuals who is going to be with God and the Lamb, and who are going to be serving him, and who shall see his face. We know who they have to be, right? They have the name on the foreheads. Well, if you look in Revelation 7, Revelation 14, who has the name on the foreheads, folks? It's the 144,000 of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's who has the name on the foreheads. So clearly this portion in Revelation 22 is about those people. It's about the healing of those people. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of those people who were going to be in that realm. the 144K, the ones with the names written on the forehead. But the point to really take note of here is that notice when they inherit that promise, notice what John says, and there shall be no more curse. So when did the curse go away? Well, it went away when death was defeated. It went away when Christ put his enemies under his feet. That was the curse. And that coincided with the destruction of the temple, the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the age. Never again would there be animal sacrifices. Never again would there be altars. Never again would there be a temple. Well, the futurists might build one, but biblically speaking, in terms of God's covenant with his people, there would never again be a system like that. And it all went away, thus eliminating the curse. There's no more curse for them because they're up in heaven. They're serving their God. They're with the God and the Lamb. And they'll see his face and his name will be on their foreheads and they'll reign forever and ever. All right, now, that's pretty clear, folks. And if it isn't, then we can just look a little further in that same chapter as John says, the time is at hand. All these things must shortly take place. Behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who keeps the word of this book because I'm coming quickly. All right, this was about to take place. It was about to be a reality for the 12 tribes. They were about to inherit the promise that Paul said the 12 tribes served God earnestly day and night, hoping to attain in Acts 26, as he spoke to King Agrippa. Even there, standing in front of the king, Paul was still very clear as to what this promise was all about and who it was for. The 12 tribes. Okay, now, again, people would say, well, Adam this, Adam that. No, I just showed you the curse is over. And here's the dagger, folks. If preterism is true, and if the Bible can be taken for what it says in terms of time statements, right? If we can believe that Jesus actually meant he would come in that generation and he would come before some standing there died, right? If that is what you believe, and it should be, it should be, because if it isn't, then you don't know what the hell you're doing with the Bible anyway, right? You should just slap yourself across the face with it. But if that is the truth, okay, and if he was coming back, and if all this was ending, and if everything was at hand back then, and if it all coincided with the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the end of the age, Israel's last days, if that is the truth, then that is 150% proof that Adam's curse had nothing to do with you and I today. Pay attention here, folks. Because if Adam's curse had to do with humanity as a whole, then Adam's curse would have never went away when Israel's days came to an end. It just doesn't work. Logically, if Adam's curse had an effect upon all humanity, then logically Adam's curse would not go away until all humanity ended, until all humanity's days came to an end. Okay, but that's not what the Bible's concerned with. The Bible speaks of Israel's last days. The Bible's last days are Israel's last days, and they took place just prior to the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the temple, the coming of the Lord, and the end of the age. That is when the curse went away, which demands, therefore, that Adam's curse was limited, it was exclusive, and it was only for those under the curse and condemnation of the law. Anyways, folks, I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, give it a like a Rooski. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and we'll see you on that flip side, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.